I found a receipt for a sandwich I hadn't even bought yet, tucked inside a sealed drainage vault that had been rusted shut since the Nixon administration. I got this email last Tuesday from a guy named Elias, who worked as a field technician for a private infrastructure firm out in the Rust Belt, and honestly, after reading it, I had to take a walk just to breathe some fresh air. He sent along some scans of the logs he kept, and the handwriting starts out so steady and professional. But by the end, it's just these desperate jagged scratches that look like they were carved with a shaking hand. I usually don't get worked up by viewer submissions, but this one feels less like a story and more like a warning about the places we aren't supposed to look. I'm just going to read it exactly as he sent it, because I think the details speak for themselves. I was 3 weeks into a contract with a company called Stratos Infrastructure, and my job was pretty straightforward on paper. I was a subsurface verification tech, which basically means I spent my days driving a beat-up white van to abandoned industrial sites and checking that the old blueprints matched the actual concrete and steel left in the ground. The site that changed everything was called the Oak Haven Industrial Annex, and it sat about 40 miles outside of any town you'd find on a map. It was a massive sprawling graveyard of brick warehouses and rusted out silos that had been used for chemical storage and heavy machinery manufacturing back in the 50s and 60s. I was supposed to be mapping the old drainage and fiber optic vaults that had been decommissioned decades ago. The pay was great mostly because nobody else wanted to spend 10 hours a day in the middle of a dead zone with no cell service and only the sound of the wind whistling through broken glass for company. My supervisor was a guy named Ben, who I only ever talked to through a ruggedized tablet the company issued me. He was one of those career bureaucrats who viewed the world through spreadsheets and progress bars. Our conversations were usually short and technical. He'd ping me a set of coordinates, and I'd spend the morning hunting for a heavy iron lid buried under layers of dead leaves and sediment. Once I found a vault, I had to pry it open with a 6-foot crowbar, drop a sonar mapping unit into the dark, and wait for the tablet to render a 3-dimensional model of the tunnel below. It was boring, repetitive work, but I liked the quiet until the morning I reached Vault 09. The lid for Vault 09 was located in the basement of what used to be a secondary cooling station, and it was the first one that gave me real trouble. The iron was so corroded that it had basically fused with the concrete frame, and I spent a solid hour hammering at the edges before it finally budged. When the seal broke, a puff of air hit me that smelled nothing like the damp, stagnant rot I was used to. It smelled like ozone and fresh rain, and for a split second, I thought I smelled toasted sourdough. I shook it off as a trick of the mind. Hunger does weird things to you when you're working in a hole. And I levered the lid open. My flashlight beam cut through the dark and landed on the ladder rungs, which were surprisingly clean compared to the others I'd seen. I climbed down about 15 feet to the first landing, and that's where I found it. Tucked into a small alcove in the brickwork was a crumpled piece of thermal paper. I picked it up thinking it was old trash from a previous inspector, but when I smoothed it out, my heart did a weird slow roll in my chest. It was a receipt from a deli in my hometown, which was 300 miles away. The date on the receipt was tomorrow's date. The order was for a turkey club on sourdough with no onions, which is exactly what I always order. I stood there in the absolute silence of that vault, just staring at that little strip of paper. It didn't make any sense. This vault hadn't been opened in 50 years, but here was a piece of paper from a day that hadn't happened yet. I took a picture of it and messaged Ben on the tablet. I typed out something like, "Hey Ben, found some weird debris in Vault 09. Looks like someone might have been down here. Recently checked the metadata on this photo." It took a few minutes for the tablet to chirp with his reply. Ben didn't even address the receipt. He just wrote, "Elias, focus on the sonar sweep for the north. East quadrant, we are behind schedule. Don't worry about litter, the wind carries things into these vents all the time." I wanted to argue that the wind doesn't carry a future sandwich receipt through a fused iron lid, but I needed the paycheck, so I just sighed and set up the sonar unit. As the sonar started its pings, I sat on the bottom rung of the ladder and waited for the model to render. Usually the tunnels were just simple cylinders or squares, But as the blue lines started to crawl across the screen of the tablet, the shape that emerged was wrong. It wasn't a tunnel at all. It looked like a room, a perfectly rectangular room with 3 smaller branches coming off it. I watched the tablet screen as the sonar filled in the details. It showed a flat surface in the center that looked like a table. It showed 4 smaller shapes that looked like chairs. My hands started to feel cold despite the humidity of the vault. I grabbed my flashlight and walked deeper into the tunnel, following the direction of the sonar sweep. About 30 feet in, the brick changed to smooth, poured concrete, and the tunnel opened up into a chamber. I panned the light around and nearly dropped the flashlight. It was exactly what the tablet showed. A table and 4 chairs, but they weren't made of wood or metal. They were carved directly out of the grey concrete of the floor, as if they had grown there like stalagmites. I walked over and touched the table. It was ice cold and felt unnaturally smooth like polished bone. There were no tool marks and no seams. I checked the tablet again and the sonar unit was still pinging, but now a new blip had appeared on the map. It was moving. A small red dot was traveling down one of the side branches toward the chamber I was standing in. I froze and held my breath. In the tunnels you can hear a drop of water hit the ground from 100 yards away, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no rustle of clothes. Just the low electric hum of the sonar unit back at the ladder. I watched the red dot get closer and closer until it was right on the edge of the chamber. I pointed my flashlight at the opening of the side tunnel and waited. Nothing came out. But the red dot on the tablet was now hovering right where I was standing. It was overlapping with my own blue icon. I spun around, swinging the light in a panicked arc, but the room was empty. I felt a sudden sharp pressure in my ears, like the air had been sucked out of the room, and I scrambled back toward the ladder. I didn't stop until I was back up on the surface and the vault lid was slammed shut. I sat in my van with the doors locked and my breath coming in ragged gasps. My tablet chirped. Ben's face appeared in a small video window, which was rare. He looked tired, his eyes bloodshot behind thick glasses. "Elias," he said, his voice sounding slightly distorted as if he was speaking through a fan. "The sonar data from Vault 09 is incomplete. You need to go back down and reset the unit. The depth parameters are drifting." "Ben," I said, leaning toward the tablet, "I'm not going back down there. There's something wrong with that vault. The sonar picked up someone else in there with me, and there's a concrete table in a drainage pipe. That doesn't make any sense." Ben just stared at me for a long beat, and for a second, I thought the video had frozen then. He blinked. "Elias," he said again, and his voice was lower this time, almost a whisper. "The data is the priority. The company needs the verification. If you don't reset the unit, we'll have to terminate the contract. You're just experiencing a bit of sensory deprivation. The silence out there can be heavy. Just do the sweep, and we'll get you a hotel in the city for the weekend on us." I should have quit right then. I should have just driven away and blocked the company's number, but I had bills to pay and a mortgage that was 3 months behind. I told myself it was just a glitch in the hardware or a trick of the acoustics in a concrete room. I took a few deep breaths, drank some lukewarm coffee, and headed back into the cooling station. When I opened the vault again, the smell of ozone was gone. Now it smelled like my apartment. Not just generic apartment smell, but the specific mix of the laundry detergent I use and the old cedar chest my grandmother gave me. I felt a surge of nausea, but I forced myself down the ladder. I walked back to the sonar unit, which was still sitting on the landing. The tablet was showing the 3D model again, but it had changed. The concrete chamber wasn't just a chamber anymore. The sonar had mapped more of the side branches, and they were starting to look like a floor plan. I traced the lines with my finger. It was the layout of the apartment I was living in. There was the living room, there was the kitchen, there was the small hallway leading to the bedroom. I felt like the walls were closing in on me. I grabbed the sonar unit to pull it up, but the cable was caught on something. I tugged it, and it didn't budge. I sighed and started walking down the tunnel toward the chamber to see what the unit was snagged on. When I entered the concrete room again, I didn't even use my flashlight because the room was already lit. A soft warm glow was coming from a lamp sitting on the concrete table. It was a replica of the lamp I had on my bedside table back home. I stood there staring at it, my brain trying and failing to process what I was seeing. On the table next to the lamp was the turkey club sandwich from the receipt. It was fresh, the steam still rising from the toasted bread. I could see the frilly toothpicks holding it together. I felt a scream building in my throat, but it wouldn't come out. I backed away and my heel hit something soft. I turned and saw a bed. A concrete bed with a concrete blanket pulled back just like I leave it in the morning. My tablet chirped again. It was a text message from Ben. Elias, the data is perfect now. We are seeing a 99% match on the internal environment. You've done a great job. Stay there for a moment, we are sending the final verification pulse. I tried to type back a message telling him I was leaving, but my fingers wouldn't move. They felt heavy and stiff. I looked down at my hands and saw that the skin was turning a dull flat grey. The texture was changing from skin to something rougher, something like stone. I tried to run, but my boots felt like they were part of the floor. I looked back at the concrete bed and I saw myself. Not me as I am now, but a stone version of me, lying under the concrete blanket with my eyes wide open and my mouth frozen in a silent cry. I don't remember climbing out. I don't remember driving away. The next thing I knew, I was in a gas station 3 towns over and the sun was coming up. I checked the tablet, but it was dead. The screen was cracked and the internals were melted as if it had been hit by a massive power surge. I drove straight back to my apartment and I haven't left since. I've been sitting here for 3 days with the lights on and a kitchen knife in my lap. I called the company headquarters, but they told me they'd never heard of a Stratos infrastructure and that they didn't have any records of a Ben or a project at the Oak Haven Annex. I thought I was safe until this morning. I went to the kitchen to make some toast and I noticed a small crack in the drywall near the floor. I leaned down to look at it and I saw something grey peeking through. I peeled back a bit of the wallpaper and my heart stopped. Behind the wall there wasn't any wood or insulation. It was brick. Old weathered industrial brick, just like the kind in the vault. And when I put my ear to the crack, I didn't hear the sound of the neighbours or the street. I heard the low rhythmic pinging of a sonar unit. I think the verification pulse Ben talked about wasn't for the tunnels. I think it was for me. I think the Oak Haven Annex is still mapping me, and it's slowly replacing the world I know with the one I found in the dark. I checked the receipt from my sandwich today. The date on it is yesterday's date, and when I looked in the mirror a few minutes ago, I saw a small grey speck in the corner of my eye. It felt smooth. It felt like polished bone. I'm going to try and leave again tonight, but I have a feeling that when I open my front door, I won't see the hallway of my building. I think I'm going to see a ladder leading up into a cooling station. I can already smell the ozone. Elias hasn't responded to my follow-up emails, and the address he sent the story from has been deactivated. I did some digging and I found out that there actually was an Oak Haven industrial annex, but it was demolished in the late 90s after some kind of massive sinkhole swallowed the entire center of the site. There were rumors that the local government tried to map the tunnels before they filled them in with concrete, but the survey teams kept coming back with contradictory reports, saying the tunnels were changing shapes while they were inside them. If any of you out there work in infrastructure or surveying and you've seen something similar, please let me know. I'd like to believe Elias just has a very vivid imagination, but every time I look at the brickwork in my own basement, I find myself checking for grey specks. I got an email last Wednesday from a guy named Gavin who worked as an independent environmental contractor in rural Iowa, and he included a set of coordinates that I've spent the last 3 days trying to cross-reference with old agricultural survey maps. He was hired to verify the status of decommissioned deep water cisterns in the empty spaces between small farming towns, and what he found buried 40 feet beneath the dry clay isn't something you can easily explain away as a trick of the light or a structural collapse. He's not looking for fame, and he didn't ask me to share his social media accounts because, frankly, he's been living out of a motel near the Minnesota border and hasn't gone back to his apartment since the harvest started. This is his record of what happened during his 3 weeks on the county line, and I think you need to hear it exactly as he wrote it down. The third cistern on the county map didn't contain water, It contained a living room from 1982, completely intact, buried 40 feet beneath a field of dead soy. I'm not talking about a cellar or a fallout shelter that someone had converted. I mean a perfect 30 by 20 concrete cylinder that should have been filled with gravel and clay, but instead held a wood-paneled wall, a gold and green floral sofa, and a heavy console television that was humming with static despite having no power source. My name is Gavin, and for 5 years I've worked as a surface inspector for agricultural land sales, which is basically a fancy way of saying I drive a dusty Ford F-150 across the state, locate old, dangerous farm infrastructure that isn't on modern GIS maps, and make sure it's capped so some kid doesn't fall into a well. It's a quiet, boring job, mostly involving lots of coffee, talk radio, and the smell of dry dirt. And that's exactly why I liked it, until I reached Section 14, just outside a dying town called Blackwood. My contact for the job was a county clerk named Clara, a woman with a voice like gravel and a habit of clicking her ballpoint pen while she spoke. We met at the municipal office, which was just a double, wide trailer with a flag outside, and she handed me a stack of yellowed blueprints from the 1960s. The developer wants to put 3,000 acres of corn in there by spring, Gavin, she said, her pen clicking rhythmically. But the old state surveys show at least 20, two deep cisterns from the drought years. Find them, drop your camera down, verify they're dry, and sign the clearance. Don't spend too much time out there. The ground is soft this year, and the locals don't like trucks idling near the fence lines. I told her it would take me 2 weeks, tops, and she just nodded, her eyes already drifting back to her monitor. The first 2 cisterns were exactly what I expected. Cracked concrete tubes, 12 feet wide, dropping straight down into the dark, filled with 30 feet of silt, rusted scrap metal, and the occasional skeleton of a deer that had slipped through the rotten wooden covers. I'd park my truck close to the edge, set up my aluminum tripod, and lower my high-definition probe camera down into the shaft, watching the grey concrete walls pass on my tablet screen. But when I reached the coordinates for Cistern 3, located in a dip between 2 rolling hills where the soy had failed and turned into a crisp, yellow carpet, the GPS put me right in the middle of nothing. There was no concrete collar, no rusted iron grate. Just a small, circular depression in the dirt, about the size of a manhole cover, filled with wild mustard weeds. I got my shovel out of the truck bed and started digging, the afternoon heat sticking my shirt to my back. About 2 feet down, my spade struck something flat and hollow. I cleared the dry clay with my hands and found a heavy steel hatch, the kind you see on municipal water mains, but there was no brand name or county stamp on the iron. It was held shut by a single threaded bolt that had rusted into a solid lump. I went back to the truck, grabbed my long, handled cheetah bar, and put my weight into it until the bolt sheared off with a loud, metallic crack that echoed across the empty field. When I pried the hatch open, the air that came out didn't smell like damp earth or rot. It smelled dry, warm, and faintly of lemon polish and carpet cleaner. I knelt by the opening and pointed my flashlight down. The beam didn't hit the bottom, it just died in a thick, velvety blackness that seemed to drink the light. I set up the tripod, secured the winch line to my probe camera, and turned on the LED lights. Drop 1. I muttered to myself, hitting the record button on my tablet. The camera descended slowly, the depth gauge on the screen ticking past 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet. The walls on the feed weren't rough concrete, they were smooth, dark, and looked almost like dry mud that had been polished with a cloth. At 5 feet, the camera stopped. The video feed flickered once, a line of static running across the screen, and then the picture cleared. I stared at the tablet, my thumb hovering over the joystick. I wasn't looking at a drywall floor. I was looking down at a ceiling. Specifically, a ceiling made of white acoustic tiles, the kind with the little silver sparkles in them that everyone had in their basements in the late 20th century. In the center of the frame was a brass light fixture with 3 round bulbs. None of them lit, but the camera's night vision showed the dust motes floating around them in the dark. I lowered the camera another 3 feet, and the lens cleared the ceiling grid, revealing the room below. There was a sofa with a pattern of large yellow sunflowers, a low oak coffee table with an empty glass bowl on it, and a shag rug that was a deep, forest green. "What the hell is this?" I said aloud, my voice sounding flat in the wide open field. I leaned over the hatch, looking down into the dark with my own eyes, but I couldn't see a thing. The distance on the tablet read 42 feet. I used the joystick to pan the camera left, and the feed showed a wood-paneled wall. Hanging on the wood was a framed cross, stitch that said "Home is where the hearth is." Below it was a television set, its wooden console cabinet scratched at the corners, and the screen was glowing with a faint, pulsing grey light. There was no cable down there, no outlet, and the power cord was lying on the green carpet like a dead snake. But the static on the screen was moving, shifting in patterns that looked almost like silhouettes of people standing in a small room. I sat there on my toolbox for 30 minutes, the wind rattling the dry soy stalks around me, trying to rationalize what I was looking at. A bunker, I told myself. A survivalist must have built a shelter down here during the Cold War, and the county records just called it a cistern to keep the land value up. But why bury the entrance under 2 feet of topsoil with no air vents? And where was the power coming from? I looked back at the tablet, and that's when I noticed the framed photo on the side table next to the sofa. I zoomed the lens in, the pixels resolving into a picture of 3 people standing in front of a blue garage door. It was a man, a woman, and a young boy of about 10. The boy was wearing a red striped t-shirt and holding a plastic dinosaur. The dinosaur was a green Tyrannosaurus Rex with a broken tail that had been repaired with black electrical tape. I knew that because I had that exact dinosaur in a box in my attic. The boy in the photo was me. My hands started to shake, the metal edge of the tablet frame cold against my palms. I zoomed in further, trying to see the faces of the man and woman, but the camera's autofocus kept hunting, the image blurring and clearing, blurring and clearing. No matter how close I got, their faces remained a soft, featureless smudge, like someone had rubbed a thumb across wet ink. The only face that was clear was mine, smiling, toothy, and 30 years younger. I hit the retrieve button on the winch, and the camera came up with a high, pitched whine that sounded like a scream in the quiet valley. When the unit cleared the hatch, I grabbed it, half expecting the lens to be covered in wet mud or blood, but it was dry and clean, smelling faintly of lemon pledge. I packed the gear into the truck as fast as I could, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I didn't cap the hatch, I just threw the weeds back over it and drove toward Blackwood, the truck's tires spitting gravel against the wheel wells. I needed to talk to Clara. I needed to know who had owned Section 14 before the county took it over. The town of Blackwood was mostly 3 blocks of empty storefronts with boarded-up windows and a single gas station that doubled as a grocery store. I pulled up to the municipal trailer, but the lights were out and the flag was gone. I sat in my truck, the engine idling, the heat from the hood distorting the view of the empty street. I pulled out my personal phone and tried to call my sister, Chloe. We hadn't spoken in 6 months. Not since our mother's estate had been settled, but she was the only person who would remember the photo with the dinosaur. The line rang 4 times before she picked up, her voice sounding distant and muffled, like she was speaking through a towel. "Gavin," she said. "Why are you calling?" "Is something wrong?" "Chloe," I said, my hand gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "Do you remember that photo of us in front of the blue garage door? The one where I'm holding the T-Rex with the taped tail?" There was a long silence on the line, just the sound of a television static in the background. It was the exact same static hiss I'd heard on the camera feed. "What are you talking about, Gavin?" she asked, her voice flat. "We never had a blue garage door. Our house in Council Bluffs had a red one. And you never had a T-Rex. You were terrified of dinosaurs when you were a kid. Don't you remember the nightmares you had about the things under the floorboards?" "No, Chloe, I have the toy in my attic right now," I insisted, my voice rising. "I know I have it. I can see the photo in my head." "You're remembering it wrong," she said, her tone suddenly very cold, very mechanical. "You always remember the dry years wrong, Gavin. Clara says you need to finish the scans in Section 14. We're waiting for the data." I stared at the phone screen. "Clara? How do you know Clara?" The line went dead. Not the click of a hang up, but a sudden drop into that deep, warm silence I'd felt when I opened the hatch of Cistern 3. I tried to call her back, but the screen just read no service, which was weird because I was parked right in the middle of the town square. I looked out the window. The gas station across the street was empty, the pumps dusty and grey, but the sign on the glass door was blinking. It didn't say open. It said calibration. I drove out of Blackwood, my tyres roaring on the asphalt, and didn't stop until I reached the next town, a place called Eldon that actually had people walking on the sidewalks and cars in the parking lots. I checked into a cheap motel, a place called The Rest, Easy, where the carpet smelled of old smoke and the TV only had 5 channels. I sat on the edge of the bed with my laptop, trying to access the state historical databases. But every time I searched for Section 14 or the history of Blackwood, the browser would spin for 5 minutes and then show an error page. I spent the night staring at the gap under the door, waiting for the light in the parking lot to flicker, but the night passed in a heavy, unbroken silence. The next morning, I woke up with my throat feeling dry and full of dust. I looked in the bathroom mirror and saw that my eyes were bloodshot and there was a thin crust of grey soil around my nostrils. I coughed, and a small puff of dry clay came out of my mouth, settling on the white porcelain of the sink. I stood there, my hand on the faucet, my mind trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe I'd inhaled some dust when I sheared the bolt on the hatch. Maybe the well was contaminated with some kind of fungal spore from the old sillage. I washed my face with cold water, but the water felt thin, almost like it wasn't wetting my skin at all. I knew I should have packed my bags and driven back to Des Moines. But there was this nagging, obsessive pull in my chest, a feeling that if I didn't go back and check Cistern 4, the space where my memory should have been would just continue to fill up with grey dirt. I got back in the Ford and drove back toward Blackwood under a sky that was a flat, featureless white, the sun just a pale disk behind the haze. Cistern 4 was supposed to be 3 miles east of 3, near an abandoned grain elevator that sat like a rotten tooth on the horizon. I found the concrete collar this time. It was cracked and covered in yellow lichen, sitting in a ditch beside a gravel road. I parked my truck, set up the tripod, and lowered the probe. I didn't want to look at the screen, but I couldn't stop myself. The depth gauge ticked past 10, 20, 30 feet. The concrete walls of the well were dry and grey, covered in spiderwebs and old mineral deposits. At 38 feet, the camera stopped. The screen didn't show water. It showed a kitchen. It was my kitchen from my apartment in Des Moines. I could see the yellow sticky notes on the refrigerator door, the dirty coffee mug in the sink, and the small wooden table with the green placemats. Sitting at the table was a woman with blonde hair, her back to the camera. She was wearing a blue sweater I'd bought her for her birthday 2 years ago. It was my ex-wife, Sarah. I watched her hand reach out and pick up a fork, moving it toward a plate of eggs that were yellow and bright. But she didn't eat. She just held the fork in the air, her arm perfectly still, for 3 minutes on the feed. "Sarah," I whispered, my thumb twitching on the joystick. I panned the camera to the left, and the feed showed the hallway of my apartment. Hanging on the wall was the mirror I'd bought at an estate sale, but when the camera caught the reflection, there was no camera in the frame. There was only me, standing in the middle of my hallway, holding the tablet, looking back at the camera with an expression of total, blank terror. The Gavin in the mirror didn't have eyes, just smooth, pink skin where his sockets should have been, like a doll that hadn't been finished. I grabbed the winch line with my bare hands and pulled, the metal cable cutting into my palms. I didn't use the motor, I just hauled the line up yard by yard, my blood smearing the silver wire. When the camera cleared the well, the smell of burnt toast and bacon hit me so hard I vomited into the grass. The vomit was grey and dry, like dry cement mix, and it didn't soak into the soil. It just sat on the dry soy leaves, a grey mound in the sun. I sat in my truck, my hands wrapped in paper towels from the glove box, the blood seeping through the white paper. I tried to start the engine, but the starter just clicked. Once, twice, then fell silent. I looked at the dashboard. The fuel gauge was on full, the battery was green, but the odometer was spinning backward, the numbers blur of white and black. I grabbed my tablet, which was still on, the screen showing the recorded footage of my kitchen. The door of my truck opened. I didn't hear it click. I I didn't feel the breeze. But Clara was standing there, her yellow county vest bright against the grey fields. She didn't look like she'd driven there, her shoes were clean, and she wasn't breathing hard. She reached out and touched my wrapped hand, her fingers dry and rough like sandpaper. "You're doing a great job, Gavin," she said, her voice sounding like it was coming from inside my own ears. "The developer is very pleased with the resolution. We just need one more scan. The main cooperative silo in section 14. That's where the reservoir is." "Clara, my sister said we didn't have a blue garage door," I said, my voice shaking so hard I could barely form the words. "Why did she say that? Why does my apartment look like it's 40 feet under a soy field?" Clara smiled, her lips cracking slightly at the corners, a tiny line of grey dust falling onto her collar. "Because you don't live in Des Moines anymore, Gavin. You haven't lived there since the dry year. Don't you remember the well? Don't you remember falling?" She pointed toward the horizon, where the grain elevator stood. I looked at it, and the distance seemed to shift, the massive concrete structures suddenly looking like they were only 50 yards away. The sky above them was turning a deep, bruised purple, the same color as the static on the TV in System 3. I got out of the truck, my legs moving without my permission, my scuffed boots crunching on the dry clay. I didn't want to walk, but every step felt like it had been planned for me 20 years ago. The grain elevator was a massive concrete fortress, its doors hanging off their hinges, the interior smelling of old chaff and damp limestone. In the center of the main floor was a massive iron grate, 40 feet across, that looked down into the main holding silo. I stood at the edge, looking down into the blackness. There was no water. There was no gravel. I could see the entire town of Blackwood down there. It was laid out like a model train set, the small streetlights glowing with a faint, yellow light, the tiny cars parked in front of the tiny houses. I could see the Copper Kettle Diner, the municipal trailer, and my own Ford truck parked in the middle of the miniature street. In the backyard of one of the small houses was a blue garage door, and standing in front of it were 3 tiny figures. One of them was holding a green plastic dinosaur with a black tape tail. "It's time to sign the clearance, Gavin," Arthur's voice said from behind me. I turned, but there was no Arthur. There was only a concrete pillar with a speaker horn mounted to it, the grey paper of the cone vibrating with the frequency of his voice. "We need to cap the well so the new crop can grow. You've been the inspector for so long. Don't you want to go home?" I looked down at my hands. The paper towels were gone. My skin was grey and hard, the joints of my fingers looking like dry clay that had been baked in the sun. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my pen, the one Clara had been clicking. I dropped it into the silo. It fell for a long time, a tiny speck of silver in the purple light, until it hit the miniature street below with a faint, metallic click that echoed through the concrete chamber. I didn't jump. I didn't fall. I just felt the space around me expand, the walls of the silo rising up until the ceiling was the sky and the floor was the dry clay of section 14. I was standing in front of the blue garage door. The air smelled of fresh rain and ozone. I reached down and picked up the green dinosaur from the grass, the plastic cold and familiar in my hard, grey hand. I'm still here. The crop is growing now. Tall, green corn that smells like old paper and lemon polish, stretching as far as the eye can see under a white, flat sky. I can hear the truck idling near the fence line, and I know there's a new inspector out there, a guy with a tripod and a camera, looking for the old cisterns. I'm waiting for him to open the hatch. I've made sure the living room is perfectly clean, and the TV is humming with his favorite show. If you're ever driving through the empty spaces between the towns in Iowa, and you see a white Ford truck parked near a field of soy, don't stop. And if you find a hatch buried in the dirt, don't try to shear the bolt. Some things are buried because they're broken, but some things are buried because the ground is still trying to figure out how to make them real. I don't think Gavin ever made it to the Minnesota border, and the municipal office in Blackwood has been listed as a historical landmark that's been boarded up since the farm crisis of 1985. I looked at the coordinates he included, and they just show an empty circle of clay surrounded by 3,000 acres of identical corn, with no access roads and no structures for 30 miles. But the thing that gets me is the photo he attached. It's a scanned image of three people in front of a blue garage door. The faces of the parents are completely blank, just like he described. But the little boy is looking right at the camera, and he's holding a green dinosaur with black tape on the tail. I used to have that same toy when I was 10, and I've been looking for it in my garage all afternoon. But all I can find in my storage boxes are jars of dry, grey soil. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you've ever found an old well in the middle of nowhere. Maybe just leave the cover on. Stay safe out there and listen to the static.